For a long time, Western observers thought China had finally found a way of having peaceful power transitions without holding elections. However, what happened next was more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. Regular power transitions may happen in a dictatorship, but it won't last long. It's like an intermediate stage which will either move toward the concentration of power by a lifelong ruler or toward decentralization and competitive elections, because those are the only two stable equilibria. Hey, this is Huey. Last time I was half joking when I said, if you ask me about China's leadership transition, I'll give you a lot more detail. But then so many people started to ask just that. You guys really want to get me sent to a re-education camp, don't you? But lucky for you, I happen to be the type who would risk their life for clicks. I'm like a fucking teenage skateboarder. So here I am again, offering my dangerous insight on how China went from a lifelong dictator to frequent leadership transitions and then back to a lifelong dictator. So firstly, how did Mao become so dominant in the Communist Party? The dude had some talent, of course, but far from the genius that you think he was. He read a shit ton of books, but mostly ancient Chinese literature and history. He knew exactly how to play politics to his favor, and he had enough bloodthirst to implement those ancient Chinese teachings on how to be a ruler. But you should know he was not a policymaker. He had zero modern scientific training. I doubt he even read the original Karl Marx. I heard he had a copy next to his bed, but you'd need some goddamn math to read it. He did write a whole bunch of stuff too, but if you really sit down and read them like I was forced to do when I was a kid, you will realize that he was not a clear thinker. Some people like those simply because he could mix a word salad in a super confident way. That probably reminds you of certain someone, right? Confidence itself, even if it's not based on actual knowledge, can still be sexy. And not only sexy to the ladies, but sometimes, to their male followers. By the way, Mao was the reason I became so alarmed about Trump from the very beginning. Lots of similarities. During the Communist Revolution, a lot of top communists were pretty skeptical about Mao. That guy was crazy about purging his own comrades, and he was sexually insatiable. But they decided to make him a god anyway, because having a cultish leader could help them win the war. Just like the congressional Republicans decided that having a cultish leader could help them win the election. They weren't wrong. Both wars and elections required a huge turnout. What's more effective for mobilization than a fucking cult? But the downside is that once your leader reaches a god status, you can no longer control him. This guy, Mr. Liu, was a smartass who made idolizing Mao a central strategy of the Communist Revolution. But ironically, in the 70s, Mao felt threatened by his influence and put him in solitary confinement until he broke and died. I'm pretty sure at some point Liu regretted his earlier strategy, just like Mike Pence to a lesser degree, but it was too late for him. I don't totally blame the communists. It was a brutal time with a zero-sum situation. The communists would probably have been executed en masse if they had lost the war. The whole world was just not civilized back then. There's no such thing as due process. So they grabbed any straw to keep the revolution afloat, including the cult of personality. The government side back then also had their own version of cult of personality, centered on this guy, just not as successful. So that was a brief answer to explain why Mao became so dominant. His colleagues voluntarily submitted to his dominance in order to win the war. They collectively shouted, "Long live Chairman Mao," in every gathering for decades. Actually, the direct translation should be 10,000 years of Chairman Mao. So even scarier than the normal translation. When you shout something like that for decades, how are you gonna ever put the beast back in the cage? So yeah, as long as Mao was alive, even if he was on his deathbed with the last breath, nobody would stand a chance against him. Now let's look at the second part of the story. No matter how dominant a person is, the moment he dies, everything changes. Stalin was a scary motherfucker, right? people trembled in his presence. But only 3 years after he died, he was literally trashed by Khrushchev, his own successor. And not long after, nobody gave a shit about Stalin anymore. Mao was not exactly trashed in the same way, because the party still needed his name and picture to keep the party together. But almost everyone around him was trashed. His wife, his nephew, his closest advisors, all put in jail. And his daughter was removed from the government. Those all happened in just a month, before the Communist Party even decided where to put Mao's body. In fact, some top leaders even used the discussions about Mao's body preservation as a front to gather and conspire against his wife. That was pretty dark. So why did they take the risk to crush Mao's inner circle? Well, you want the new government to function, you need a clear-cut succession. But Mao never spent enough time to nurture an actual successor because he didn't trust anyone. Stalin was like that too. People in their position don't like to have a clear successor. Because once you make it clear who will be the next boss, people will start sucking up to that person, which will undermine your authority. And remember this guy. He was once named as Mao's successor clearly in the formal party documents. Maybe that's why he got cocky and eventually got himself killed. So, a lot of dictators died without a clear successor. If you watched House of the Dragon or any similar stories, you should know how dangerous that is. Of course, a modern way of solving that problem is to have elections. The votes will help clear things up. But in countries without elections, not having a clear successor is a problem. So the top ranking guy in China at the moment was the vice chairman and premier Mr. Hua. He had Mao's blessing through a piece of handwritten note before his death. Mao's handwritings, of course, carried a lot of weight, but he wasn't sure if that note was enough to deter Mao's family members, especially his powerful wife. He felt like the only way to nip the threat in the bud is to lock them up. Honestly, I wouldn't have a better idea either. It's one of those scenarios where if you don't do it to them, they will do it to you. Simple. But the arrest wasn't a simple job because Hua was a relatively new player in the top circle. So he had to form a broad coalition with military leaders, founding fathers, and bureaucrats, and all those people to secure the operation. And that broad coalition basically set the tone for China's political climate in the next 40 years. No one was allowed to do things totally on their own. You have to seek some sort of consensus. Then 2 years later, the new leader who locked up Mao's wife was himself removed by a new coalition led by Mr. Deng, who won over the party's central committee with a promise of economic reforms. It wasn't too hard for Deng to get on top because he was one of the most senior figures during the revolution. But he didn't have a clear legitimacy either. He didn't go through any elections, obviously, and he didn't have Mao's direct endorsement. Also, he wasn't the only founding father alive. There were still a bunch of them. And most of these founding fathers were still traumatized by the arbitrary punishment during the Cultural Revolution. So they weren't ready to start another round of cult personality for Deng. So eventually they made some sort of a power-sharing agreement in the early 80s. Deng would be in charge of the military, and the guy who was widely recognized as a steady hand would serve as the General Party Secretary, which was actually the highest rank in theory. When there was a formal event or something, his name was normally announced before Deng. And then there was a president. He was kind of ceremonial, sort of like the German president. I don't know what his duties were exactly. And then there was also a premier who was in charge of the day-to-day administrative issues. So like I said last time, nobody knew exactly who made the final decisions. I'm pretty sure they had meetings all the time, but who made the call? No clue. Then in the late 80s, disagreement started to arise, and Deng started to assert his authority. He accused the General Party Secretary of capitalist liberalization, which was basically another way of saying he gave people too much freedom. Well, if you ask me, I don't remember having much freedom at all. But somehow Mr. Deng thought it was too much, and he forced the General Party Secretary, who ranked higher than him, to resign. And then a couple years later, in 1989, that removed guy suddenly died. which immediately triggered a huge protest. You guys remember the short-lived revolution in Les Miserables, right? The death of a prominent figure sometimes can serve as a rallying cry. And you all know what happened next. Guns were fired and Deng removed another general party secretary for refusing to endorse the shooting. Then it was followed by a mid-scale purge to root out other skeptics in the party. At this point, a natural move for Deng would be declaring himself as the supreme leader. But then there was a problem. The dude was 85, 3 years older than Joe Biden is right now. He knew he couldn't run a one-man show much longer. In fact, he never could, because like Mao, he was a political puppet master, but not a policy expert. So he made a very unusual move after Tiananmen. I don't know anyone else in the world who did that. He not only appointed a successor, but also the successor of that successor. He set up this new norm in which one top guy leads the party, the military, the government at the same time, but has a term limit of 10 years. This way, the top guy wouldn't face too much policy resistance, but also wouldn't become overly powerful. Sounds like a nice compromise to maintain a collective dictatorship, and it largely worked as intended. The next two leaders were powerful but constrained by the term limit. Obviously, they had to tread lightly, because they didn't want to end up in jail after retirement. Of course, they didn't have to care about human rights or other trivial stuff like that, but at least they had to seek consensus from the top layer of the party. Okay, that was a super brief summary of the second period, and why no one could stay dominant. For a long time, Western observers thought China had finally found a way of having peaceful power transitions without holding elections. Must be some Confucius or Taoist wisdom, right? Brilliant. However, what happened next was more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. When I talked about it on TikTok, people thought I was kidding until they Googled it themselves. So the current leader, Mr. Xi, became the VP in 2007, 5 years before the formal succession. So everybody thought it was a done deal. The VP would be the next leader without any question. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, another powerful party member started to campaign for the top job. Of course, it wasn't the Western kind of electoral campaign. This guy never publicly announced that he was running for president. But unlike other Politburo members, he started to get on TV all the time. He made speeches, he attended all those hyper-communist concerts, and he announced some tough-on-crime policy reform in the huge city he was running. And he also approached a lot of power holders behind a closed door to garner their support. For my taste, he was a pretty cringe and creepy guy. But China had never seen a politician who actively promote themselves for the top job, and people were intrigued. Plus, Xi's position as the heir apparent was not assigned by Deng or any founding fathers. And nowhere in the constitution said the VP had to become the next president. So who's there to stop the competition? It caused a storm on social media. People even started to wager who the next president would be. It was so much fun. But some party leaders were definitely concerned. As I said, when you have more than one contender, but no formal elections to arbitrate who wins, you could end up in a precarious situation. The armed forces could split into two camps and start pulling guns at each other. Just like the House of the Dragon stuff, right? But fortunately for the party, there was a small accident. That contender's wife murdered a British citizen. That lady was something. She made the British guy drunk and then fed him poison from a traditional soy sauce bottle. You'd expect some sexier container, right? And of course, her hubby covered it up. If they had just killed a Chinese citizen, which I'm sure they did more than once, no one would have found out, and no one would have cared anyway. But this time, a white Brit was dead. And a local police chief blew the whistle because he feared he might become the loose end. He didn't tell it to the Chinese media because they wouldn't have published it anyway. Instead, he went to a US consulate because he probably wanted to seek asylum in the United States. But the funny thing is that police chief himself had a reputation of human rights violations. Torture, disappearance, extrajudicial killings, you name it. So if Obama had taken him in and put him in some American suburb, the optics would have been disastrous. That's my guess anyway. There was no formal statement, but eventually that guy had to walk out of the consulate and get arrested. The next time he appeared in court, he was in a fucking wheelchair. The party elites were probably grateful that he destroyed one of the contenders and made way for a smooth transition. But still, you can't let a whistleblower go unpunished, can you? So that's how President Xi secured his succession. For outsiders, it may have looked quiet and peaceful, but if you had really followed the events, you'd know it was this close for the transition to turn to shit. The party elites didn't say it in public, but I bet a lot of them started to doubt the term limit. They wouldn't want a drama like that to happen every 10 years. This time they got lucky. What if next time there's no murder? Then how are they gonna get rid of one of the contenders? Then the commoners will want to have a say. They're gonna demand a vote. That's not acceptable. So you see, regular power transitions may happen in a dictatorship, but it won't last long. It's like an intermediate stage which will either move toward the concentration of power by a lifelong ruler or toward decentralization and competitive elections. Because those are the only two stable equilibria. President Xi, of course, chose the obvious option. In just a few months, he purged more rivals than his predecessors did in the previous 30 years, including the aftermath of Tiananmen. He even jailed one of the Politburo Standing Committee members, which never happened since the 70s. And he called the mass purge a anti-corruption campaign, but the party used to have some implicit factions, because when power changed hands frequently, the previous leaders, the current leaders, and the future leaders, they were like different gravity centers and attracting different elements. But not anymore. There's only one faction now. You either get on board or we move your ass to jail. And of course, Xi also got rid of that annoying term limit. If you ever took a Chinese politics class in the US in early 2000s, you probably remember it was all about leadership transitions and factions. And the scholars spent so much effort trying to figure out the personnel patterns during the transitions in order to predict who's going up and who's going down. And all of a sudden, that knowledge became obsolete. There won't be a transition anymore. Xi is only 71 years old. That's like the new 50. Next time you see a power transition in China, it will be the AI taking over, okay? I'm genuinely curious how they teach Chinese politics these days. This is our guy. That's it. You'll get an A if you learn to pronounce his name. Class dismissed.